Tonight, we could have a break in the impeachment stalemate. We're going to show you the very latest and also where we go from here. Then, House Democrats, they want to curtail the president's powers to order airstrikes and attacks without congressional approval. They took a major step in that direction today, and even some Republicans have come along. Then, we are going to make you a part of the program this evening. We open up our phone lines to you. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo, he just announced he wants recreational marijuana legalized this year. I want to know if you support the decision. Call us. Toll-free lines open right now, 888-766-2428 or 888-RNN-CHAT. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. As mentioned, we're going to be getting to your reaction a little bit later in the program. Now, another reminder, on those phone lines, they are open and they fill up fast, so I suggest you join us sooner than later on what has been a cultural debate here that we've been having in state after state and quickly is gaining momentum nationally regarding legalizing marijuana. Okay, first though, let's get you up to date on impeachment because we have some developments today, and for that I want to bring in senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman. We're getting there.
We are, Rich. No deals or compromises to report on and no movement on witnesses, but there is growing reason to believe that the impeachment trial of President Donald John Trump in the U.S. Senate could start as early as next week. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave only cryptic clues in her weekly press conference this morning, telling reporters, quote, "I'll send them, the articles of impeachment, over when I'm ready." And she talked again of insisting that the Senate codify rules that include witnesses before she does. But this afternoon, multiple outlets reporting Pelosi is preparing to transmit the articles soon, perhaps within 24 hours. And there are reports that Pelosi is meeting with allies and committee chairs, laying out the groundwork and her rationale for doing so. Pelosi's position may be impacted by a slight shift among some Democrats on the Hill. These 4 Democrats, including a committee chairman, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and a U.S. senator, have all spoken on the record in the past 24 hours about the trial needing to begin soon. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell is looking to force Pelosi's hand if she doesn't send the articles soon. He's now backing a bill that would allow the Senate to dismiss impeachment altogether if the House doesn't transmit the articles within 25 days of a president being impeached. That deadline would hit next Tuesday. Republican Senate leadership, including McConnell and John Cornyn, now saying they do expect to receive the articles tomorrow, with a trial to begin next week. Final impeachment note, Adam Schiff today saying he will not call John Bolton to testify in the House, as some Democrats had been calling for. Rich, back to you.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. Tomorrow, potentially a very big day. All right. Today, however, we had an important move here. It may not turn into anything tangible like new regulations, but nonetheless, an overdue debate. The House of Representatives, they have now voted literally within minutes to limit the president's power to take further military action against Iran. Now, this is a live shot you're looking at right now, the vote ongoing, but already enough votes here, largely along party lines, although it should be noted a few Democrats voted against the measure and a few Republicans voted for the measure that would require congressional approval moving forward for any other attacks on Iran in the future. Now, this would now head to the Senate. And there will face an uphill climb since there is, as you know, a Republican majority there. But a couple of Republicans, Rand Paul and Mike Lee, 2 senators, indicated they would support this. So this could be by a razor-thin margin if this is shot down. And if you didn't get to hear Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, yesterday, he made it very clear. He was irate by how the legislative body, in this case the Senate, was handled not just before the fact, but after the fact with the briefing.
The briefing lasted only 75 minutes, whereupon our briefers left. This, however, is not the biggest problem I have with the briefing, which I would add was probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate.
Now you know why he's a likely yes vote to limit presidential authority. Also, even before the House vote took place today, President Trump, he was scoffing at the very idea that he needed congressional approval to take military action.
To take further military action against Iran, would you seek congressional approval?
It would all depend on the circumstance. I don't have to, and you shouldn't have to be able, because you have to make split-second decisions sometimes. Sometimes you have to move very, very quickly, John.
Now, both sides made their cases on the House floor today. Take a listen.
This resolution has as much force of law as a New Year's resolution. It is nothing more than a press release to appease their socialist base. But what message is it sending to Iran? That we are strong, determined, and united as a country? Or that we are divided, short-sighted, and weak?
Questions of war and peace are the most fundamental of the issues that come before this Congress. They require deliberate and thoughtful decision-making. This action by the administration was not that.
This escalation with Iran must end. Congress must reassert its war powers authority, and I urge adoption of the resolution.
I also want you to take a listen to Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, who put into context the ideas of checks and balances.
The framers acted against a background of kings and princes plunging their populations into wars of vanity and political advantage to distract their people at home from the political problems of the kingdom, of the monarchy. And our framers were emphatic that the awesome power of war, the power over life and death of our sons and daughters, the power over our national treasure not be invested in one man alone, but rather in American democracy itself.
All right, so let's do a little history lesson here, pivoting off of what we just heard from the congressman. Constitution, it gives Congress the authority to declare war, but it also gives the president the responsibility of being the commander-in-chief. The framers, they intentionally split war powers between the two branches of government, that in an attempt to prevent unilateral action. But Congress has not declared war since World War II, and the two branches, they've clashed over war powers ever since. In '73, this all came to a head after it was revealed that President Nixon secretly ordered the bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. After that, Congress passed a law mandating that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of committing U.S. forces abroad. It also required presidents to end overseas involvements after 60 days if Congress has not passed an official declaration of war. Now, President Trump appeared to be evoking the 48-hour rule when he sent this tweet within 2 days of the U.S. strike that took out the Iranian general. And I quote, "These media posts will serve as notification to the United States Congress that should Iran strike any U.S. person or target, the United States will quickly and fully strike back, and perhaps in a disproportionate manner. Such legal notice isn't required but is given nonetheless." Exclamation point. Now, you fast forward to when we talked about Nixon. You go to 2001, just days after 9/11, Congress passed something called the Authorization for Use of Military Force, or the AUMF. Now, what this did is it authorized the president, any president, to use the military against those responsible for terror attacks. It also authorized the use of force against any nations, groups, or people who carried out, planned, or aided in the 9/11 attacks. Then, 2002, Congress expanded that by giving the president authority to use the armed forces to defend against any threat of Iraq, and the Bush administration used that authorization to then invade the country the very next year. And I bring Andrew back here because I thought it was very telling how animated Senator Lee was, the Republican from Utah that we just played the clip of. And he was in part because not just that he found the briefing to be woefully inadequate on facts. Remember, the president said imminent was the justification for why I took out Soleimani. But he said that the briefers, when pressed for, he thought, rational hypotheticals, well, if you can do this, so why couldn't you go after this, that, or the other thing, they implied to him that it was unpatriotic to even question a military action. And that's what made him red in the face, among other things. So I found it interesting, some of the voices that supported this. Congressman Getz, who I thought embarrassed himself during the impeachment inquiry when it was the judiciary just a few weeks ago, he said, you know, if we're willing to send our young men and women into harm's way and they have the courage to do so, we, meaning the body of Congress, should at least have the courage to vote on something one way or the other. This is not just Trump. This has gone on for prior presidents, but nonetheless, particularly with this president and the fears and the lack of judgment that may go into this, I don't know what's going to happen in the Senate, but we know he ain't going to sign it. But I understand the logic of this.
I do too. By the way, it doesn't have to be signed by the president. It's a concurrent resolution.
Right,
so
right, yeah, exactly.
the question is, will it get through the Senate? And it probably won't. The competing forces here are, for Republicans, the natural conservative/libertarian notion that the president is not a king, does not have unilateral power, and that Congress has to sign off on these sorts of things. We heard that a lot from Republicans, for example, whenever President Obama engaged in military action, whether it be in Libya or in other places. There was a lot of talk from Republicans about that. But at the same time, this is a different Republican Party than we had 4 years ago or 10 years ago. They are incredibly beholden to Donald Trump, refusing to question him. And the point that you made about, especially with this president, is a point that they could never make with the position they put themselves in.
You know, to me, it's interesting because there's a lot of subtleties here in a certain degree, because we go back to bin Laden. No one would have argued at the time that if Obama had never consulted anyone in Congress, that there was such a limited window for obviously a better part of a decade. We've been hunting unsuccessfully the author of 9/11, that we wouldn't have had this conversation. But he still managed to not only consult the top levels of intelligence. Apparently, you know, the National Security Council wasn't even advised of what Trump did here. But there was no attempt from the president to talk to the Gang of Eight, as it's called. He spoke to certain Republicans, but he never talked to the Speaker, which he's required to, and he never gave advance notice to this, which would have, I think, politically been a smarter move for him anyway, right? Put the other party in the defensive. But Soleimani, so people know, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration could have taken him out at different times, and he certainly was an unsavory character. They chose not to because of the fear of the consequences that this might have evoked, and we still don't know how this ends with Iran right now.
Yeah, there's another difference too, and you're right that Obama did notify the Gang of Eight before the attack on bin Laden, whereas Trump did not with the attack on Soleimani. The other big difference between the two of them is that Soleimani is a government official from an actual nation state. He's the military head of Iran. And in that case, you can only, under international law, take somebody out if they're actively engaged in the battlefield. Whereas bin Laden was a terrorist, didn't have a nation state that he was connected to, and so nobody questioned the validity of the president's ability to strike at any point. So that's one of the issues in terms of the imminent threat.
So we talked a little, Andrew and I, on the politics of this. Let's look at the legal aspect of this as well. To help us with that is Professor Bruce Ackerman, a constitutional scholar. He teaches law and political science at Yale University, and he's kind enough to give us a few minutes. And if some of you may have seen, he penned a piece recently in the American Prospect that the war against Iran is an impeachable offense. Before we go down that road, we gave a brief history lesson to our audience, Professor, about the War Powers Act and how it was drawn up. How much discretion is given to a president, given, and let's say in this case, and we can certainly debate this, let's say it was an expedient issue, that time was of the essence and he had to make a call here. Sure. What is still required of him by law in terms of notification and to whom?
Well, this is precisely the point. In 1973, after the tragedy of Vietnam, Jacob Javits, who was a leading Republican at that time, said, "We cannot let this happen again. We just the founders, when they issued their constitution, we were a small-time minor country, 3,000 miles away from the big powers of Europe. Now we are the mega power of the world. We have to just not say Congress has the right to power to declare war. We have to have clear and specific rules so as to control presidential abuse. And that's what they did. They had very clear rules. So the second provision of the statute says, whenever it's possible, the president shall, whenever there's an imminent danger of a conflict, imminent danger, consult with Congress first. It is an absolute obligation to consult with Speaker Pelosi and the president, the presiding officer of the Senate. President Trump showed that it was possible because he consulted for a number of days. We don't know how many, a few, maybe a few weeks. Precisely, he consulted with his close advisors and indeed a couple of hawkish Republicans, Lindsey Graham, for example. But he refused to consult with the Speaker Pelosi or the President pro tem of the Senate or the leading committee chairman in charge of national security. This is a fundamental breach of the War Powers Act, which is enacted so that Congress could maintain control. You see, once the president just goes out on his own and commits an act of war, well then, Congress is confronted with a fait accompli. They have to do things. But so it's absolutely essential for him to consult ahead of time. Please.
The president seemed to argue, maybe he didn't adhere to certainly the spirit of the War Powers Act, but he said, as long as I send a tweet within 48 hours, I'm complying with the letter of it. I grant you that's a tortured rationale, but does he meet the letter of this by notifying us within 2 days?
Absolutely not. The first thing, there are no spirits here. We are talking about clear rules, you see. Now, the second rule that he violated is that when he did submit a piece of paper, it wasn't merely a tweet. His office did submit a piece of paper. It was labeled top secret, and it just contained some counterintelligence information. Now, if Nancy Pelosi or other serious constitutionalists in the Congress had seen this ahead of time, they would have said, hey, remember George Bush? Remember we went to war against Iraq on the basis of counterintelligence. And it turned out that it was completely erroneous. This counterintelligence, which said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction which were threatening the United States, it turned out to be true. This stuff that you've given us is even less good because even your own National Security Council hasn't actually investigated it. Don't you think that you should pause and find out about this? This is what we in Congress insist upon. Now, the basic structure of the War Powers Resolution you have to distinguish between these two cases. If there are, let's say, 500 troops, and they're in Iraq or anywhere else, and a bunch of guerrillas supported by Iran or some ISIS or some other group of terrorists attacks them, then of course they can act in self-defense. And that's not an act of war, that's just self-defense. But when you kill a second or third highest official in the state of Iran, whether you like it or not, Iran is a state recognized by all states, just like the United States government. This is from the legal point of view, and I'm only talking law here. From the legal point of view, this is like some country saying, hey, you know, the director of the CIA in the United States is planning or considering a whole host of attacks. Let's assassinate him. This is an act of war under international law. There's no question about it, and it's an act of war under the War Powers Resolution.
Professor,
we have to make that distinction.
Well, let me get one more distinction. We know, going back to when Osama bin Laden was killed, that then President Obama did actually notify the powers that be beforehand. To that end, was he required to do so because bin Laden was not a former representative of a foreign state here. In every instance, if a president decides on foreign soil to take out any leader, do they have to have an official title here that requires notification, or does it matter if they're a leader of a terrorist organization, let alone a general in an army?
Well, we have to take 2 steps back. After 9/11, George Bush, whatever you think the merits of his decisions were, went to Congress and obtained an authorization as required under the War Powers Act to attack Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden is associated with the government which was crushed there. So the President of the United States had an authorization from 2001 to wipe out the problem that caused 9/11. Similarly, when so far as the 2002 authorization, it was an authorization to the United States to introduce military forces to eliminate the threat posed, and I quote, by Iraq. Now, this is the key clause, you see, by Iraq. What happens, so George Bush obeyed the War Powers Act, and Osama bin Laden, there's not a constitutional or legal problem.
Finally, Professor, and I only got about 30 seconds, if you follow the logic that the administration has put forward, that basically trust them. They say it's imminent. They don't have to provide evidence to this point for it because they say it's classified, and moreover, they say this guy had not only blood on his hands, but he had American blood on his hands. If you follow that logic, could you then say, well, Assad in Syria, he's also a credible target, and if the president wanted to, he could order a strike, and take out, whether it be Assad or pick your despot that you want in the globe. Is their argument that basically it's up to the president to decide?
They have not made an argument. In fact, the Trump administration's Office of Legal Counsel did issue an opinion to support Trump's first attack on Syria. And it said not every attack is an act of war. We have a very limited attack on some terrorist, some missile sites. But this time, it admitted that an act of war would require consultation and approval by Congress. This time, they haven't given an official explanation whatsoever, because what they have done is inconsistent with their own opinion. And so they have just said nothing. They have just given this problematic, confidential information. The report requires them to explain the justification. They have not given any, and that's why it's entirely legitimate for this to be a third count of impeachment. This is precisely what the founders was committed to. They disagreed about many things in Philadelphia, but the thing that they were committed to was that the President of the United States could not make war, just like King George III did, to crush the colonies without the consent of Parliament. This is absolutely the foundational principle of checks and balances. And if this is permitted to be Trump, then future presidents, and this is what I'm so terribly concerned about, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there will be a similar situation in which a president of one party, one or the other, will be facing perhaps both houses of Congress who won't like what he's doing. And they will use this as a precedent for attacking the president. And the president will then try to divert opinion by bombing one or another country and trying to get up a tremendous amount of patriotic ardor. This will be the normalization and routinization of impeachment and the encouragement of foreign adventures by a single person in charge of the most powerful military in the world. This
Professor,
is
I got to wrap it there,
tragedy.
but with it now
sorry.
passing the House tonight, it'll be really fascinating what happens in the Senate with already a couple Republicans coming out in opposition of the president's handling of this, and it's becoming the norm here. Norms being upended, so we'll find it is.
This is a tragedy in the Greek sense. This is a terrible moment in the history of the Republic, and we the people, the American people, must support the Congress in its insistence that we cannot let a single person who might be good sometimes, might be bad sometimes, use his military power to generate nuclear disasters.
Professor Ackerman, thank you so much. All right, folks, when we come back, I'm opening up the floor to you. We're changing the topic here, and we're getting your take on a controversial issue that's certainly been in the news lately. Do you support legalizing recreational marijuana? This isn't some theoretical debate. State after state, including in our region, are considering doing just that. Our toll-free lines are open right now. We'll give you the background and get your take. 888-766-2428.